Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, the Ten Commandments, we've read them. They got read this morning. And we pay lip service to the fact that they're very important. We should take them very seriously. And, we have fights about over whether they should be posted or not. Well, they are in Aspen. I don't know if you recognize that, but I was walking down Hopkins Street and at Connor Memorial Park. There they are. Chiseled into stone, the Ten Commandments. So, they seem really important, don't they? Well, if you looked at the title of today's sermon, I suggest that there are two commandments that we are taught are good to break, that we shouldn't keep. Now, make no mistake about it. We break a lot of those commandments from time to time, and we try not to. But there are two of them that we're told we should break. Now, not directly, but everything we're taught tells us that's a good idea. So, have you figured out which two they are yet? Any suggestions?
Bear false testimony. Bearing false testimony.
Bearing false testimony, that'd be a good one, but people still have this thing about lying. They don't think that's right. We're not taught that it's good to lie, at least not usually. Although I think you can find times when we are taught that. A hint, they both have to do with economy.
Keeping the Sabbath and coveting.
Keeping the Sabbath and coveting. He got both of them. Very good, Dave. All right. Those are the two.
Which was the second one?
Coveting. Coveting. Maybe that economic thing. Yes, those are the two. We're taught that it's really commendable to break those two. Now, not really. We say that's not true, but we teach that it is. Well, first of all, the Sabbath. We still get people saying, well, gee, businesses shouldn't be open on the Sabbath because that makes people work on the Sabbath because they have to be on businesses. Now, I don't hear that nearly as much today as I did when I started preaching 40 years ago. So maybe that's gone away a lot. Now, in Colorado, the only ones who keep the Sabbath are the car dealers because by law they can't be open on Sunday. But we don't keep the Sabbath. We don't because of what we're taught. We're taught that we ought to always be productive. We ought to always be doing something. We always ought to be making a difference, always. 24/7. Now, 25 years ago, if I said 24/7, I would have to explain it. Today, nobody has to explain that. And if you aren't plugged in 24/7, you're lazy. You're undependable. You're irresponsible. You're just not much credit to humankind. Well, what does that say then about someone who takes 1/7 of their life and rests? Man, are they ever lazy? And yet, that's what the commandment says. That we aren't to work all the time. That there should be time set aside. And as we said, the second one is, thou shalt not covet. Now, that really is something we are taught we should do. We should covet. We should want stuff. Now, this sermon, I have to say at this point, is probably going to offend some people, okay? And that's not what I mean here. I need to hear this sermon as much as any one of you. Because we do buy into this things give us wonderful happiness or whatever. We covet stuff. We want stuff. Our whole culture and economy is based on that. But you know, it's not only ours. Even in the Old Testament times, people coveted. In fact, Solomon, who we say was the wisest person who ever lived, had 1,000 wives and concubines. Now, wouldn't 100 or 200 been enough? You know, the problem with coveting is we don't know when to stop. We just keep going and going. And what God was trying to do with these 10 commandments was to help us live a deeper, happier, more satisfying and fulfilling life. And in keeping all of these commandments, that's what it does. But you know, when we break the commandments, we're not living as joyfully as we could. These 2 commandments are about taking time out from coveting and using it for something else. But our economy says constant work is what's important. That's what we're told. Always. Constant work. You know, and we do that and we keep coveting, and what happens are all these bubbles, you know? First it was the tech bubble. Then it was the credit bubble. Then it was the real estate bubble. What bubble will be next? You know, people gathering all the stuff and then losing it. And then working again. Making us work harder and harder. You know, for us, all we have to do is watch the television ads. You know, the Kia ad says, every person deserves a new car. It's in the Constitution. Or maybe it's in the Bible. I'm not sure where it is. But every person deserves a new car. Well, is that true? Or maybe it's the ad that says, we can get you the credit you deserve. Let's see. I think you already have the credit you deserve. That's why you can't buy a new car. You know, then I love this one. You know, it's a little more expensive for this hair cover, but you're worth it. Now, what makes you worth being a blonde or brunette or a redhead? We're worth it. We deserve it. We're owed it. We're entitled to it. You know, all of the ads have one thing in common. They make us want and covet things we didn't even know we needed. Think about it. How wrapped up are we in that? Now, before we get too far along this, I want to suggest that probably everybody shouldn't follow these immediately because the results would be catastrophic. Think about what would happen if we quit consuming and everybody only bought food. Well, we'd all starve is what would happen because the economy is based on consumer activity. And so I'm not suggesting that we all go out and change immediately. I'm saying that we need to mitigate our coveting and begin to take the Sabbath seriously. Because when we do that, something happens. All of a sudden, we have no time. Time that I'll talk about in a moment, but a little more on our activities, because we know that if we quit consuming, the economy would crash. You know, in the last big recession that we had, people started spending less. They stopped going to restaurants, and the result was that many of the people in the food industry got laid off. And people who used to be serving food ended up at food banks. So yeah, there is interconnectedness. But I think we could do better in getting a sustainable economy that allowed for time other than production. Think about it. The problem is, and the stress that we get, is most of us think that coveting these things, that having more, will bring us happiness. But guess what? Money does not buy happiness. You heard it here first. Well, maybe for the 1000th time. You know that. But we don't know that in our actions. Now, there have been a lot of research done about happiness and wealth. And what's been found is somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 in America, depending on where you live, somewhere between those two things of family income. Beyond that, happiness and income have no relationship. Now, under that, they do, because if you're constantly striving for basic health, basic help for your children, then, yeah, you've got to have some money, or it does affect your happiness. But once you get to that point, more doesn't make you happier. Somebody making $140,000 a year is not twice as happy as somebody making $40,000 a year. And many millionaires are not as happy as people making 1/15th the amount that they make. There's no correlation, and yet we think there's going to be happiness from that. There's no correlation between how big a house you have, how nice a car you drive, and how happy you are. Your happiness comes from other places. Your meaning. I'm reminded of Jesus' parable of the guy who was really a wealthy and successful entrepreneur, and he built all these barns. And as he built the barns, finally he said, I've gotten enough. And Jesus says, God said that night, you fool, tonight you're going to die. You're not going to eat, drink, and be merry as you think, because you waited too long. And we know. Now, what we don't know about the story is the guy was a smart guy, and he'd done estate planning, and his children got everything except he gave enough to the church so that he didn't have to pay taxes. You didn't hear that part of the story. But he still didn't have anything. You know, it is important that we think about what we're doing. We cannot accumulate stuff to guard us from unhappiness. It just doesn't work. You know, in fact, I ran across a saying that says, a man's, and this is mainly for men, I'm not using this generically, a man's happiness is inversely related to the number of internal combustion chamber instruments he owns. Because if you own your ATV, your snowmobile, your jet ski, your car, your four-wheel drive, everything else, they'll break down. You got to insure them. You just have more and more worries. And you're less and less happy. You know, to say, I don't like stuff, now comes the personal part, it's not true. I love stuff, as most of us do. In fact, you know, in 2011, I bought a new Ford Fusion. It was the first new car I had bought for 25 years. And it's been a good car. It's good transportation, it's comfortable, it's economic. But last September, I went to the Snowmass Wine Fest, and they also had this other little thing happening that I saw and walked through, and it was the Ferrari car show. And I looked at those and I said, wow, you know, if I could just have one of those, that would be driving a car. Wow. But I don't really have $200,000 to spend on a car. But you get the idea. Each of us has desires. God knew that. And coveting, going to extremes, makes us very unhappy people. Makes us shallow people. Makes us people who don't get to the depth of what's important. We all might feel a little uncomfortable about breaking these two commandments. But not so much that we want to do anything about it. Well, I've talked about the negative parts of not having the Sabbath and coveting. Well, what's the positive aspects of obeying those commandments? Well, as I've already kind of indicated, the biggest positive aspect is that we have time. Now, that was true when they were given to the Israelites in the desert. That's true of us today. Now, the Israelites were working, and they worked a lot longer than 8-hour days. They worked all the time. And God knew that just to work, which they had to do in order simply to survive, was not enough. And so time was carved out so that they could do something else. And that something else was to develop relationships between God and with other people. When you look at the Ten Commandments, that's really what they're about. But in order to develop those relationships, we have to have time. And it's that time that we need. Our relationship with God could be strengthened through prayer, through taking time to pray. Now, too often, today, our prayer is just more coveting. Have you ever noticed? Gee, God, could you get me this? Could you do that? But when we understand, our prayers become, thank you for what we have. Thank you for this wonderful place we live. Thank you for all of the people you've given me. Prayers of thanksgiving. And then the other part, which I'm going to focus on a little, is prayers of meditation. Now, during Lent, we've been doing something different in our communal prayer here on Sunday morning, which is I've been asking you to meditate. Now, meditation kind of is a two-edged sword because we think of good things and bad things about it, Some people think, well, is it really Christian or is it something that's Buddhist and we ought to be doing and not doing it, or Christians are just trying to copy Buddhists? Well, that's not the case. Every major world religion has a tradition of meditation. Because meditation in its easiest form is simply being aware. Of being aware of what's happening right now. How much of our lives are thinking about the past? How much of our lives is thinking about the future? Is there anything left for now? It's about being aware, being in the present, rather than doing or wanting. Just being. And it's in our being, in our moments of being, that we most deeply encounter the ultimate reality of the universe. And we've all meditated. It's our natural state of rest. When all of a sudden we are here. You've experienced it or at least I've experienced it, many of us have experienced it, when you gaze up at those stars at night. All of a sudden, that's it. Or maybe you've been caught up in a piece of music that's also something I find, and yours may be different. Maybe yours is work of art of some sort. You're caught up and time seems to be gone. There is no time. We naturally go into meditative states, just not very often, and we don't set time apart to do it. No, I could probably go on a long time about meditation because I practiced it during my life at different times, not tremendously so. So it's very limited, to tell you the truth. But this Lent, I have really sensed a call to go deeper into this practice. I now have probably half of the books in central Colorado on meditation. You order them from the library and they get them. So I've got one from Frisco. I got one from Steamboat Springs. I've got one from Lakewood. I've got several from Aspen, from Pitkin County Library. But Pitkin County, you just put on the hold and they get them, and I pick them up there. So I've got a lot of them. I'm looking through them. I'm going to read one in a minute. But basically, all of them come to the same orientation, which is about rest, being alert, and in that time, going deeper and connecting basically with God in a new and different way, not with words, not with actions, but just being. It's not a new thing in Christianity. It's a very old tradition. The Desert Fathers and Mothers in Egypt from the 3rd century meditated. Brother Lawrence, one of my favorites, called this awareness just being aware of what was going on. He basically worked in a kitchen. He was in a monastery, a Christian monk. But he called it the practice of the presence of God. And I'm going to read just a brief, it's kind of an introduction that was written in one of the books that I checked out by Frances Adney. She's a professor at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. As a Christian, I've practiced various forms of silent meditation. I remember sitting under the grand piano as a child of 3, watching the sun flit through the white curtain during those 1-hour home communion services of the Plymouth Brethren. Most of the hour was spent in communal silence, gathered around a small table upon which was placed wine and bread. My memory of these meetings are filled with a sense of awe and presence. I practiced a different kind of meditation as a young adult when I spent 6 weeks living on the beach in Greece. I saw a few people apart from my 2 companions and the shepherdess who brought her flock to the meadow each day. I spent hours watching the waves or studying the grains of sand on my feet, and I never missed a sunset. At certain times in my life, there were more intentional, prayer-filled kinds of silent meditation. Wordless yearnings and grievings were brought to those meditations as I sought understanding and peace during times of illness, loss, and confusion. During the 1990s, while living in Indonesia, I frequently visited a Trappist monastery in central Java. My spiritual director, a German priest who lived down the mountain, said to me, "Come and see." Father Hama introduced me to sitting in a gentle, non-technique-oriented way. He called it contemplative prayer. I took up the practice daily during a difficult time of loss in my life. Spiritual retreats at the monastery up the mountain helped me learn to let go of what I could not hold on to in life. It was there that I began to experience the delight and calm that comes from the practice of meditative silence. This silent meditation differed from other practices of silence that I had known, and it differed in significant ways. One, it was not focused on an interchange between God and myself. I was simply entering a place of silence. Two, it was not predicated on specific ideas about God or thoughts about writings in the Bible. I did not need to frame this time of silence with religious meanings. Three, it was not focused on an outcome. I neither expected nor did I ask for changes in myself or the world. Yet, there were ways in which this practice of meditative silence was framed by my Christian faith. In taking up this practice, I felt I was intentionally entering God's presence. While not looking for spiritual experiences, I was somehow seeking life. I did not believe that God, and I did believe that God met me in those silent moments. More than once, I had experiences of sightings or even meetings with the divine. During the 7 years that I have practiced entering silence, the space that I enter has grown larger, and the conviction that I am entering and becoming part of God's presence deepens. One person who has meditated a lot longer than I have. But I would suggest that we think about our prayer life, always. What's it about? Is it an extension of our coveting? Or do we really release? Not worrying about the past, not thinking about the future, but being in the presence so that we can truly unite with God. Now, if we were to take these two commandments seriously, have a Sabbath, and lessen our coveting, we would have much more time to explore and strengthen our relationship with God, and much more time to strengthen our relationships with others. And after all, that is what the Ten Commandments are all about.